Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 06, Episode 09. Today we're diving into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History to unravel the complex legacy of a statesman whose assertive foreign policy earned him immense public adoration, even as it strained relations with monarchs and allies alike.
Quite a character, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is to really understand the extraordinary career of Lord Palmerston, how he shaped British foreign policy for decades, and why his approach was both celebrated and, well, sometimes strongly condemned. We'll be exploring the specific sources that shed light on his principles and his practice, really giving you a shortcut to grasping this pivotal figure in British history.
And it really was an extraordinary career. I mean, Palmerston's time in politics spanned from 1807 all the way to 1865. That's almost the entire 19th century.
Incredible longevity.
It really is. And what's fascinating, sort of unique really, is that despite being an Irish peer, he served as an MP in the House of Commons for his entire career. Very unusual path for someone of his status back then.
Right.
So as we go through his story, we'll try to uncover how his dynamic personality and strategic mind influenced global events, everything from European revolutions to the Opium Wars, and why his legacy, even today, remains such a subject of debate. It's a journey through an era where personality often shaped policy directly.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with Palmerston the man and his modus operandi, his MO. He began his political journey as a Tory MP, Newport, Isle of Wight, 1807.
That's right.
And then Secretary at War at just 25. In 1809, he held that for nearly 2 decades until 1828.
A very long time in one junior post, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and he built a reputation as a highly efficient administrator during that time, though the sources also mention he was perhaps better known for numerous love affairs.
Ah, yes, that certainly added to his public image, didn't it?
That seems so. His political shift began because he was, sympathetic to Huskisson and the enlightened Tories.
The more reform-minded wing.
Exactly. Those pushing for things like free trade, parliamentary reforms. So when Huskisson disagreed with Wellington, Palmerston resigned alongside him and quickly joined the Whigs.
A pivotal moment.
And when the Whigs came to power in 1830, Grey appointed him Foreign Secretary. Boom, straight into the deep end.
And his career trajectory from that point on is really quite remarkable, isn't it? Foreign Secretary from 1830 to 41, then again 46 to 51, then a stint as Home Secretary, 1852 to 55.
Right.
And then Liberal Prime Minister twice, first 55 to 58, and then again from 59 until he died in 1865. Very few politicians have that kind of staying power at the very top.
It's incredible. And what's truly intriguing, you mentioned his personality. During those first 2 periods at the Foreign Office, Palmerston became, immensely popular with the general public. Why do you think that was?
Well, a big part of it, as Lowe suggests, was probably because he was prepared to stand up to foreign countries, giving that clear impression that the British were, shall we say, far superior to everyone else.
Tapped into national pride.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is the contrast, isn't it, between that public adoration and his relations with other politicians and even royalty. He could be quite arrogant and abrasive, apparently. He frequently upset Queen Victoria. She felt he should have consulted her more on foreign policy matters, which was a significant constitutional point at the time.
Right. The royal prerogative was still a live issue.
Very much so. In fact, in 1851, the Prime Minister, Russell, actually insisted on his resignation. Why? Because Palmerston had acted rashly without informing either the Queen or the rest of the cabinet.
Wow. So real friction there.
Definitely. Yet, despite these internal struggles and, importantly, his consistent opposition to extending voting rights to the working classes at home, he remained hugely popular to the end. It really speaks to how public perception can diverge quite dramatically from elite opinion or even his own domestic policies.
That's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
How did that personal style, that abrasiveness, that willingness to go it alone, how did that actually impact his ability to achieve his goals?
Right.
Was it a hindrance sometimes, or maybe surprisingly an advantage?
I think it was often both, actually. His colleagues might find him difficult, sure, but his decisive action, his confidence often got results, and the public loved that perception of strength. And sometimes that directness probably cut through diplomatic fluff, too.
Okay, so given this complex figure, what were the fundamental ideas guiding Palmerston's foreign policy? Lowe lays out, 6 core principles?
Something like that, yes. Though we'll see how flexible they were.
Right. Well, the first one is probably the most obvious, least surprising. his unwavering determination to defend British interests and prestige,
Yeah.
wherever they seemed threatened.
Absolutely key.
So that meant everything from protecting trade with China, keeping an eye on Russia regarding India, pushing back against French influence in Spain.
And even looking after individual British citizens abroad, like that famous Don Pacifico case we'll probably get into.
We will. And beyond just protecting interests, Palmerston understood something crucial about public opinion, didn't he?
Oh, definitely. Like Canning before him, he developed this remarkable skill in using the press, publicizing issues, drumming up support from all classes. He was, really ahead of his time in that sense, a very modern politician connecting directly with the people.
He certainly seems like it.
Yeah.
Another key principle, apparently, was his firm belief in spreading liberalism.
Constitutional governments.
Exactly, like Britain's own system after the 1832 Reform Act. He welcomed revolutions sometimes if they led to that.
Yeah.
France in 1830, Greece later on.
And this is a big but.
Yeah, there were clear limits to his liberalism, especially at home, right? When it came to extending voting rights in Britain itself, he consistently opposed any further expansion, right up until his death.
Which is a key insight into his character, isn't it? Supporting liberalism abroad, maybe, but not necessarily radical reform at home. And this also connects to his support for nationalism, another powerful force across Europe then. He backed these movements, sometimes quite actively, especially if they advanced British interests.
Like the Belgian revolt against Holland.
That's a prime example, 1830 to 39, and also during Italian unification later on, 1859-60.
Okay. And beyond managing crises, it's interesting that one of his stated aims was actually, well, global peace. Britain as the champion of justice and right.
Lofty aims.
How did he see that happening? Ideally, through diplomacy, working through the Concert of Europe, right?
The Concert of Europe, yes. This idea of the great powers acting together to keep the peace. It was a direct legacy of the Napoleonic Wars, trying to prevent another huge conflict.
But, as you hinted, Palmerston wasn't always a team player in that concert.
Not when British interests demanded otherwise. And that links to the final principle, preserving the balance of power, making sure no single country got strong enough to dominate Europe.
Okay, so 6 principles. British interests, public opinion, liberalism abroad, nationalism when useful, peace through diplomacy if possible, and the balance of power. But Lowe then reveals this crucial pragmatic truth. In practice, none of these principles except the first was binding.
Exactly. What does that tell us? It tells us Palmerston was fundamentally a great improviser, someone who used events, used circumstances, primarily to maintain Britain's status as a great power. Everything else was secondary.
He had that famous quote, didn't he?
He did, declared it in Parliament. We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal, and those interests it is our duty to follow.
Pretty blunt.
Very. And you see this flexibility, this pragmatism in action constantly. For instance, he wanted liberalism to spread, yet he continually supported Turkey, a notoriously illiberal state against Russia. Why? Because that policy protected British interests in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Right, strategic location.
Precisely. Similarly, though he approved of nationalism in principle, he sent no real help to the Poles or the Danes when they were fighting for their own national causes. It always came back to British interests, first and foremost.
Okay. So with those principles, or perhaps that overriding pragmatism in mind, let's turn to the immediate challenges he faced when he first stepped into the Foreign Office in 1830. A really tumultuous time.
It was. He inherited 3 pretty tricky problems almost straight away, all involving Britain's relations with France, interestingly.
What were they?
The Belgian revolt against Holland, revolutions kicking off in Spain and Portugal, and the outbreak of war between Egypt and Turkey. The Eastern question flaring up again.
Okay, let's tackle Belgium first. The Belgian Revolt, 1830 to 1839. What was the core problem there?
Well, the union of Belgium with Holland, which had been set up back in 1815 by the Vienna settlement, just wasn't working. So the Belgians revolted, declared independence in October 1830, and that directly breached the Vienna settlement, which was, the cornerstone of European peace at the time.
Big implications.
Huge. Now, both Britain and France actually favored Belgian independence in principle. But Britain greatly feared that a new Belgian state might fall under French dominance. France was still seen as the traditional enemy, remember?
Right, close to British shores, too.
Exactly. And to complicate things even more, the autocratic powers, Austria, Russia, Prussia, They wanted to suppress the revolution entirely. They didn't want similar ideas spreading in their own empires.
So Palmerston's aims were, well, pretty complex. He wanted to cooperate with Louis Philippe, the new French king, to be strong enough to warn off the autocrats, prevent a wider European war, and secure Belgian independence. But at the same time, he had to make absolutely sure French troops didn't just stay in Belgium and annex it. That's a delicate tightrope to walk.
It was, and his handling of it was, frankly, masterful. Palmerston took the lead. He chaired an international conference in London, November 1830, worked closely with the French representative, the famous Talleyrand.
Ah, Talleyrand.
Indeed. And he secured Belgian independence, in principle. Surprisingly, he even got recognition from the autocratic powers, partly because they were busy with their own revolutions elsewhere.
Clever timing.
But then, a new alarm. The Belgians invited Louis Philippe's son to be their king. Palmerston saw this as a backdoor union between France and Belgium. He immediately threatened war, started fleet movements, real hardball diplomacy.
Did it work?
It did. Louis Philippe was forced to decline the offer for his son. Later, when French troops did enter Belgium to drive out the Dutch, Palmerston took another firm line. He warned them, "One thing is certain, the French must go out of Belgium or we have a general war, and war in a given number of days."
Yeah, he didn't mince words.
Not at all. And Louis Philippe backed down again?
So the outcome was, as Lowe says, strikingly successful for Palmerston. A new constitutional state, friendly to Britain, created right on its doorstep. France kept out, and crucially, without a European war.
Exactly. This really earned him that reputation as a champion of nationalism, even though, as we've said, his main aim was always British interests. Even Talleyrand, no fool himself, called Palmerston certainly one of the most able men of business whom I have met in my career. High praise.
High praise indeed. Okay, next up, Portugal and Spain in the 1830s. What was the issue there?
Well, by coincidence, the rightful rulers in both countries were child queens. Maria of Portugal, Isabella of Spain. Both were supported by constitutionalists, but were opposed by their autocratic uncles, Miguel in Portugal, and Carlos in Spain, who wanted to scrap the liberal constitutions.
Sounds like trouble.
It was. France strongly supported the queens. The autocratic powers naturally wanted to intervene on behalf of the uncles. And for Britain, there was significant naval and commercial interests in the Mediterranean at stake, especially with Gibraltar being a British colony nearby.
So again, Palmerston had multiple balls to juggle. Support the queens, work with France, but stop them gaining too much influence, and warn off Russia, Austria, and Prussia.
Precisely. And he took decisive action, as usual. He sent a menacing British fleet off the Portuguese coast. He even financed a naval expedition that, in 1833, defeated Miguel and drove him out of Portugal.
Pretty direct intervention.
And the following year, 1834, he masterminded a treaty, the Quadruple Alliance, that brought Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal together for joint action against the uncles.
How did that turn out? Mixed results, you suggested?
A bit mixed, yes, but largely favorable for Britain in the end. Success in Portugal was lasting. They became a firm ally. In Spain, though, success was more short-lived. Carlos escaped. The Civil War, the Carlist Wars, dragged on until 1839. And the Quadruple Alliance itself actually broke up in 1836 when the French pulled out.
Ah.
But despite that, French influence in the Iberian Peninsula was kept to a minimum, and the alliance had lasted just long enough to keep the other autocratic powers from intervening directly. So a qualified success, you could say. It shows that even successes in foreign policy can be temporary.
Right. Okay, that brings us to the third major issue, Mehmed Ali, Turkey, and the Eastern Question, 1831 to 1841. This sounds incredibly complicated.
Oh, it was. The Eastern Question, basically, what happens as the Ottoman Empire weakens, was a constant headache for European powers. This crisis involved Mehmed Ali, the Turkish governor of Egypt, who was really acting independently.
Right.
He invaded Syria when the Sultan didn't give him a promised reward. Then his son marched on Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. Russia saw a golden opportunity here. They intervened, ostensibly to help the Sultan, but really aiming to control the Dardanelles Straits.
And control the Dardanelles.
Absolutely.
That was the nightmare scenario for Britain, wasn't it? Giving Russia naval access to the Mediterranean.
Exactly. It potentially threatened British trade routes, especially to India, and undermined their naval dominance. So Palmerston must have been incredibly worried about Russian expansion and the potential collapse of Turkey altogether.
So what were his aims here?
His main aim was to end the conflict quickly, remove Russia's excuse for being there, preserve Turkey as a buffer state, frustrate French ambitions because France was actually backing Mehmet Ali, and, crucially, get rid of that Russian-Turkish Treaty of Unkiar-Skelessi from 1833.
What did that treaty do?
It basically gave Russia special military advantages and effective control over the Dardanelles if they chose to exercise it. Palmerston hated it.
So how did he handle this tangled mess?
His actions in 1840 were classic Palmerston. Decisive. He engineered an agreement in London, but this time he deliberately excluded France. He brought Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia together to offer Mehmet Ali terms.
Isolating France. Bold.
Very.
Yeah.
When Mehmet Ali refused the terms, Lowe says a major European war seemed likely. But Palmerston was convinced Louis-Philippe wouldn't risk war against four major powers. He famously instructed the British ambassador in Paris to tell the French minister, Thiers, that if France begins a war, she will to a certainty lose her ships, colonies, and commerce, and that Mehmet Ali will just be chucked into the Nile.
He really didn't pull any punches, did he?
Not Palmerston. Allied action followed swiftly. British and Austrian forces captured Mehmet Ali's ports in Syria. A British fleet bombarded Alexandria. Classic gunboat diplomacy again.
And the result?
A huge win for Palmerston, probably Palmerston's greatest triumph, according to Lowe. Mehmet Ali was forced to accept much harsher terms. Syria went back to the Sultan. More importantly, the Straits Convention was signed in 1841.
What did that do?
It closed the Black Sea entrance, the Dardanelles, and the Bosphorus to all warships when Turkey was at peace. This effectively canceled Russia's special advantage from Unkiar-Skelessi.
Brilliant.
It really was. Russian expansion was checked, French ambitions were thwarted, and amazingly, all without a war between the great powers. It also showed his flexibility working closely with autocratic Russia and Austria when British interests demanded it.
Okay, let's shift focus further east now. China and the Opium War, 1839-1842. What were the origins there?
Well, it was rooted in the British import of opium grown in India into Canton in China. The Chinese government claimed, quite reasonably, that opium smoking was ruining the health of its people. They banned the trade and then seized over £1 million worth of British-owned opium and destroyed it.
Understandable from their perspective.
Absolutely. But tensions escalated further when the British refused to hand over some British sailors involved in a drunken brawl where a Chinese man died. The British cited concerns about Chinese judicial processes, potential torture, and jurisdiction.
So how did Palmerston respond?
He demanded compensation for the seized opium and guarantees that British merchants would be free from interference. When the Chinese refused, he dispatched a naval and military expedition to Canton.
Was it just about the opium and the sailors?
Partly, yes. Defending British honor, getting compensation. But Lowe suggests a bigger motive, forcing the Chinese to open up their massive market, 350 million people, to more British trade. Until then, only Canton had been open. The fighting that followed became known, of course, as the Opium War.
And the outcome?
British forces with superior technology and training easily defeated the Chinese. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, actually under Peel's conservative government, as Palmerston was out of office by then, was a significant win for Britain. It opened 5 treaty ports to trade. It exempted British merchants from Chinese law within those ports. Extraterritoriality granted £6 million in compensation and leased the island of Hong Kong to Britain.
A major shift in Sino-British relations.
Absolutely. A brutal demonstration of gunboat diplomacy, really, setting a pattern for Western interaction with Asia for decades.
It wasn't universally popular back home, was it?
No, not at all. While it was seen as a success for British trade and prestige, Palmerston faced severe criticism in the House of Commons for forcing Britain's will on a weak and defenseless country. But, love it or hate it, it certainly solidified the Palmerston legend. He was seen as someone who got things done for Britain.
Okay, so that first decade saw Palmerston rack up some really impressive, if sometimes controversial, diplomatic victories. But then, as you mentioned, the Whigs fell in 1841.
That's right, a conservative interlude from 1841 to 1846 under Sir Robert Peel. His foreign secretary was Lord Aberdeen, who pursued a much calmer, more conciliatory foreign policy. He actually worked hard to improve Anglo-French relations, which Palmerston had definitely strained.
A different style altogether.
Completely. Aberdeen even managed to settle a potentially dangerous border dispute with the USA peacefully, a real contrast to Palmerston's more confrontational approach.
But Palmerston wasn't out for long. He returned to the Foreign Office in June 1846. And immediately, it seems, his impatience resurfaced over Aberdeen's handling of the Spanish marriages problem.
Yes, he jumped right back in. And ironically, the Spanish marriages affair turned out to be a bit of a diplomatic defeat for Palmerston. French manipulation, even bribery apparently, led to Queen Isabella marrying her elderly cousin and her younger sister Louisa marrying Louis Philippe's younger son.
Creating the potential for a French prince on the Spanish throne.
Exactly, if Isabella had no children. Both Palmerston and Queen Victoria were furious. They felt they'd been completely outmaneuvered by the French.
But there was an irony here, wasn't there?
There was. While it was a diplomatic defeat in the short term, it ironically shattered the Anglo-French cooperation that Aberdeen had built, which actually gave some comfort to Russia and Austria. Furthermore, Isabella did eventually have children, so the French prince never got near the throne. And perhaps the biggest irony, Louis Philippe himself was overthrown by revolution just 2 years later in 1848.
So a short-term loss that ultimately meant very little in the grand scheme of things.
Pretty much. And speaking of 1848, that was a truly momentous year, wasn't it? Revolutions just swept across Europe.
The springtime of peoples.
Indeed. Inspired by that powerful mix of liberalism and nationalism, Louis Philippe overthrown in France, replaced by a republic, Italians in Lombardy and Venetia trying to throw off Austrian rule, Hungarians, Bohemians fighting for more freedom from Austria. Europe was absolutely ablaze.
So how did Palmerston navigate this? His policy showed all his contradictions again, didn't it?
It really did. On one hand, he had genuine sympathy for many of the revolutionary movements, especially the Italians. He famously saying, "I cannot regret the expulsion of the Austrians from Italy." Given his reputation, you might expect him to jump in and offer full support. But, as always, British interests came first. He actually wanted the tottering Austrian Habsburg Empire to survive, fundamentally, as a check on Russian expansion in Eastern Europe. And he also feared that the new French Republic might send military help to the Italians, increasing French influence there.
So, sympathy, but tempered by strategic calculation.
Exactly. Consequently, Britain largely limited itself to what Lowe calls verbal activity. Palmerston protested atrocities, like those committed by the Austrians against Hungarian rebels. He supported figures like the Hungarian nationalist Louis Kossuth, even sending British warships to the Bosphorus at one point to deter Austrian and Russian action against Turkish territory where Kossuth had fled.
So, a lot of diplomatic maneuvering, but not direct military intervention.
Right. It was a very careful balancing act, trying to support liberal ideals, maintain British influence, but without destabilizing the overall European balance of power.
And the result in 1848.
Well, a general European war was avoided, which was a plus. The balance of power was more or less preserved, but Britain had, in reality, made very little impact on the main course of events. It showed the limits of British influence sometimes, even under Palmerston.
Okay, moving on slightly, the Haynau incident in 1850 sounds, well, bizarre.
It really was a perfect example of Palmerston's flair for controversy. So this Austrian general Haynau, notorious for brutally suppressing revolutions, including ordering the flogging of women.
Nice chap.
Quite. He decided to visit a London brewery. Barclay and Perkins, some of the draymen recognized him, shouted, "Down with the Austrian butcher," and set upon him and chased him through the streets. He had to hide in a pub and be rescued by the police.
You couldn't make it up. What was the fallout?
Well, Queen Victoria was naturally horrified and demanded that an official apology be sent to the Austrians. Palmerston sent one, but he couldn't resist adding his own opinion. He told the Austrian government that Haynau was really asking for trouble by coming to Britain, given his reputation, and that he personally regarded Haynau as a great moral criminal.
Oh, dear.
And to make matters even worse for his relationship with the Queen, he only showed her a copy of this rather insulting apology after it had already been sent.
That must have infuriated her, undermining her constitutional role.
Absolutely. She expected to be consulted fully on foreign affairs. Palmerston was clearly challenging that, setting the stage for a major showdown.
Which brings us, I suppose, to the Don Pacifico affair, also in 1850. Another classic Palmerstonian moment.
Textbook Palmerston, there was this long-running dispute with Greece over unpaid loans. Things came to a head when Don Pacifico, who was a British citizen born in Gibraltar, actually, though of Portuguese Jewish descent, had his house in Athens burned down by an anti-Semitic mob during Easter celebrations. He demanded huge compensation from the Greek government, something like £27,000.
A vast sum, then.
Absolutely. And Palmerston's response was typically, well, high-handed. He used a British fleet, which just happened to be in the Eastern Mediterranean already, to blockade Greek ports. They started seizing Greek merchant ships until the Greek government agreed to pay some compensation.
Gunboat diplomacy again. How much did they end up paying?
Much less than demanded. Eventually settled for about £6,550.
But the political fallout must have been considerable.
Oh, huge. Both the French and the Russians protested vehemently. They argued Britain shouldn't have acted unilaterally, that they should have been consulted as co-guarantors of Greece. Back home, Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, the Conservatives, even members of Palmerston's own Whig cabinet felt he'd gone way too far. He was facing a vote of no confidence in Parliament.
Looked like he might be finished.
It did. But Palmerston, faced with potential resignation, rose magnificently to the occasion. He gave this absolutely brilliant speech lasting 4.5 hours to the House of Commons.
4.5 hours?
Can you imagine? He defended his entire foreign policy record since 1830, and it included that incredibly famous declaration. As a Roman in days of old held himself free from indignity when he could say, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, so also a British subject, in whatever land he may be, shall feel confident that the watchful eye and the strong arm of England will protect him against injustice and wrong.
Wow. Powerful stuff. Did it work?
Completely. He won a comfortable vote of confidence. His popularity outside Parliament soared a blaze of popularity. But as Lowe points out, that immediate popularity tended to obscure the fact that Britain had gained nothing tangible from the affair except to annoy France, Austria, and Russia, who basically saw Palmerston as a bully, especially when dealing with weaker states. And this affair really hammered another nail into the coffin of his relationship with the Queen and Prince Albert. It was nearing the breaking point.
And the final straw wasn't far off, was it? Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat in France, December 1851.
That was it. Louis Napoleon seized power, making himself virtually a dictator. Palmerston actually approved, privately at least. He thought a strong government in France would prevent socialism taking hold and bring economic stability.
But he made a mistake.
A fatal one, politically speaking. Without consulting the Queen or the cabinet again, he casually told the French ambassador in London that he congratulated Louis Napoleon on his success.
Oh, Palmerston.
Exactly. Victoria, who detested Louis Napoleon and would have preferred the old King Louis Philippe back, seized this chance. She demanded that Palmerston should be sacked immediately. And this time, Prime Minister Russell, knowing Palmerston had overstepped the mark and lacked support, requested his resignation. Palmerston gave it.
So he was out. But it left a big question hanging, didn't it?
It absolutely did. By resigning relatively quietly, Palmerston avoided a direct public clash with the monarchy over foreign policy control. But it left unsettled the question of who really controlled British foreign policy. Was it the foreign minister, or was it the monarch? A crucial constitutional gray area remained.
And Palmerston didn't take it lying down, did he?
Not a chance. He was furious, blamed Russell, and apparently took great pleasure in helping to bring down Russell's government just a few months later in 1852. He certainly knew how to hold a grudge.
And yet, despite that dramatic exit from the Foreign Office, he bounces back again, becomes Liberal Prime Minister in February 1855.
Astonishing resilience. His main task initially was to bring the ongoing Crimean War to a satisfactory conclusion. And apart from one short break, he remained Prime Minister right up until his death in October 1865.
And still dealing with major global issues in that final decade. The Indian Mutiny in 1857.
A huge crisis for the British Empire.
A second war with China from 1857 to 1860.
We need to touch on that one.
And the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865.
Huh.
His political life truly was a marathon, right to the end.
It really was. Let's quickly look at that second war with China, 1857-1860. What sparked that?
Well, according to Lowe, the Chinese had been pretty reluctant to stick to the terms of the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, still trying to limit foreign merchants. The flashpoint this time was the seizure by Chinese authorities of the Arrow.
The Arrow.
Yeah, a small ship, apparently owned by a Chinese pirate. But it had been registered as British in Hong Kong, though, crucially, its registration papers had actually expired.
Ah, technicality.
A big one. The British consul in Canton demanded the release of the crew and an apology for insulting the British flag. The Chinese refused, arguing, quite reasonably, it was a Chinese ship involved in piracy and his British papers weren't valid. So, the British warships bombarded Canton again.
So, Palmerston was in a tricky spot. Because the Chinese actually seemed to have a good case.
Legally, yes. But Palmerston felt obliged to back his officials on the ground once they'd taken their stand. His motives seemed twofold again. Upholding British prestige, avenging the perceived insult to the flag, but maybe more importantly, using it as a pretext to force the Chinese finally to accept full-scale trade relations across the country, whether they wanted it or not.
And he took this to the country, didn't he?
He did. He actually fought and won a general election specifically on the China issue in March 1857. That gave him the mandate to send a strong joint Anglo-French expedition. They captured Canton in 1858, then marched on and captured Peking itself in 1860.
And the outcome?
The Chinese were forced to agree to pretty much all demands. Several more ports opened, foreign diplomats allowed in Peking, and even the opium trade was regulated rather than banned.
So another triumph for Palmerston.
In terms of achieving British objectives and boosting his own popularity, yes, he soared again. British merchants were obviously thrilled, but that initial 1856 bombardment was seen by many, even then, as a breach of international law. The whole war was another stark example of Palmerston bullying a much weaker country. It really highlights that tension between success for British interests and the, let's say, questionable morality of how it was achieved. Popular doesn't always mean right, does it?
A recurring theme with Palmerston. Okay, let's shift to Europe again. Italian unification, 1859, 1860. What was Britain's role there?
Well, Italy was still fragmented, large parts under Austrian control or influence. Nationalists like Count Cavour in Piedmont, Sardinia, and the famous Giuseppe Garibaldi were pushing for a united democratic Italy. Piedmont, with French help, defeated the Austrians in 1859 and captured Lombardy. But the Austrians looked set to intervene to stop further unification, rushing troops into Venetia.
A critical moment, and
Right.
Palmerston stepped in.
He did. He announced very publicly that Britain would not allow armed intervention by the Austrians to prevent the central Italian duchies from joining Piedmont. He asserted that the people of the duchies have as good a right to change their rulers as the people of England, France, Belgium, and Sweden.
A strong statement invoking the principle of self-determination. Did the Austrians heed the warning?
They did. Facing that stern warning, and perhaps wary of wider conflict, they decided against direct intervention beyond Venetia. That was a key moment.
And Britain helped Garibaldi too, didn't they?
Indirectly, but crucially. When Garibaldi famously led his red shirts to capture Sicily and then cross to mainland Naples, Lowe notes that British warships protected Garibaldi's invasion force as it went ashore, essentially providing a naval shield. They were also conspicuously present when he crossed the Straits of Messina, which deterred Napoleon III of France, who was thinking about stopping him.
So Britain played a significant enabling role. What were Palmerston's motives? Pure sympathy for Italian nationalism?
As usual with Palmerston, it was mixed. Yes, both he and his Foreign Secretary Russell, and indeed much of British public opinion, genuinely sympathized with the Italian cause and disapproved of Austria's repressive rule. But there was always the practical, strategic side.
Which was?
A united Italy, friendly to Britain, would be a significant advantage in the Mediterranean. It could act as a valuable counterbalance to French hostility and potentially lead to lower tariffs for British goods. So idealism and good old British self-interest working hand in hand.
And this Italian policy is seen as Palmerston's last great success in foreign affairs, isn't it?
It is. He and Russell gained a reputation as genuine friends of the new Italy. Its unification, Lowe argues, was made possible in part because Britain had restrained other powers from intervening. It shows how even indirect support or preventing others from acting can be pivotal.
Okay, let's turn across the Atlantic now. Britain and the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. How did Palmerston's government navigate that? British sympathies were divided, weren't they?
Very much so. The middle and working classes, especially in industrial areas like Lancashire, were largely against slavery and tended to sympathize with the North, particularly after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But in political circles and among the aristocracy, there was considerable sympathy for the Confederacy, the South, often framed in terms of their right to self-determination.
A tricky balancing act for the government, then.
Absolutely. Given these divisions, Palmerston and Russell announced that Britain would remain strictly neutral. But neutrality proved difficult to maintain.
Yes, there were those incidents involving ships, weren't there? The Trent affair first.
That's right, November 1861. A Northern Union warship forcibly stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent, on the high seas, and seized 2 Confederate diplomats who were on board heading to Europe.
A clear breach of international law. How did Palmerston react?
Predictably, he was furious. He drafted a very strongly worded protest demanding their release, which could easily have led to war. But fortunately, Prince Albert, in what turned out to be his very final political act just before he died, persuaded Palmerston to tone down some of his more insulting phrases. The message was still firm, but less inflammatory. Lincoln's government wisely decided to back down and released the diplomats. War was averted. A very close call.
A crucial intervention by Albert, and the other incident, the Alabama.
Yes, the Alabama incident in 1862. The Confederacy had ordered several warships to be built secretly in British shipyards. One of them, the CSS Alabama, managed to slip out of Liverpool before officials could detain it, despite protests from the U.S. government. It went on to cause immense damage to northern merchant shipping throughout the war.
A major diplomatic blunder for Britain.
It certainly was. Lincoln's government protested furiously that this was a breach of neutrality. Foreign Secretary Russell had delayed ordering the Alabama's detention, a costly error. However, learning from this, the British government later did detain 3 more Confederate warships being built in Britain, preventing further friction with the North on that score.
And meanwhile, the war was having a devastating economic impact back in Britain, wasn't it? The cotton famine.
Yes, the northern blockade of Confederate ports cut off the main supply of raw cotton to Britain's vital textile industry, especially in Lancashire. It caused severe hardship, throwing over 500,000 people out of work. The situation only began to ease later in the war as alternative cotton supplies started coming in from places like Egypt and India.
So, assessing their handling of the Civil War overall.
Well, despite the serious blunder over the Alabama, Palmerston and Russell did manage to achieve their primary objective. They, quote, at least kept Britain out of the American Civil War. Given the pressures, the economic hardship, the divided sympathies, the diplomatic crises, that was probably a significant achievement in itself.
But Palmerston's final years weren't all about success, were they? Lowe highlights some significant failures, particularly concerning Poland in 1863, and then Schleswig-Holstein from 1863 to 1864.
Yes, the Emperor came to be failing him a bit towards the end. What happened in Poland?
The Poles revolted against Russian rule again in 1863. Both Palmerston and Napoleon III of France publicly protested the Tsar's brutality and even hinted at possible action. However, Palmerston then rejected Napoleon III's specific proposal for a European Congress to discuss the issue. Without French cooperation, Britain couldn't act alone militarily.
So no help arrived for the Poles.
None. They were crushed with great cruelty by the Russians. Lowe calls this Palmerston's first obvious failure in foreign affairs. They'd made threats, or strong hints that they couldn't actually back up. British prestige took a severe knock.
And then immediately came Schleswig-Holstein. Another complex dispute.
Extremely complex. A long-standing issue over whether these 2 duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, populated by both Germans and Danes, belonged to Denmark or should be more independent within the German Confederation. In 1863, Denmark tried to fully incorporate Schleswig, which breached an earlier international treaty from 1852. And Otto von Bismarck, the rising Prussian leader, saw this as a golden opportunity.
An opportunity for Prussia.
Exactly. Palmerston miscalculated badly here. He decided Britain must support Denmark. Why? Partly due to public opinion, partly because the Prince of Wales had recently married a Danish princess, but also because Palmerston correctly suspected Bismarck's wider ambitions. Lowe mentions Palmerston worrying about Bismarck's dream of a German fleet and the wish to get Kiel, a key potential naval base in Holstein.
So Palmerston issued a warning.
A very public and strong one. He warned that if any state attacked Denmark, those who made the attempt would find that it would not be Denmark alone with which they would have to contend, basically threatening intervention.
But Bismarck called his bluff.
He did. Bismarck, working shrewdly with Austria, guessed that Palmerston was bluffing. He knew Britain wouldn't act alone, and Palmerston had just alienated France over the Polish issue, rejecting joint action. So Prussia and Austria invaded the duchies in February 1864.
And Britain.
When the Danes inevitably appealed for the promised British help, Palmerston found his cabinet refused to risk a major European war over the duchies, especially without allies. Britain did nothing. Denmark was quickly defeated and forced to surrender both Schleswig and Holstein.
A major humiliation for Palmerston.
A huge one. Lowe concludes he seriously underestimated the astuteness of Bismarck and the growing threat of the Prussian army. He made threats Britain couldn't or wouldn't carry out. He refused joint action with France, which might have deterred Prussia, and he ended up playing right into Bismarck's hands by encouraging the Danes to resist when they were technically in the wrong regarding the 1852 treaty. It was during this affair that the opposition leader, Lord Derby, famously described Palmerston's foreign policy as just meddle and muddle, a stark contrast to his earlier triumphs.
So wrapping this all up, what does it mean for the legacy of Lord Palmerston? Old Pam, as his admirers called him. He died in office in October 1865 after this incredibly long and mostly remarkably successful career. How do historians sum him up?
Well, Theo Hoppin, quoted by Lowe, sums him up quite neatly. He says Palmerston had made himself the embodiment of a very wide spectrum of opinion. How? By being, in many respects, the most modern politician of his day, by cultivating the press, appealing to public opinion on grounds of national pride, taking his policies to the people. Hoppen concludes he achieved his unique place through sheer professional skill.
High praise for his political craft.
Yes, but there's a counterpoint. James Chambers, his more recent biographer, also quoted, points out that Palmerston's reputation has not worn well. He's often judged negatively today by the way he did it, that bullying, high-handed style, or by the criticisms of those he thwarted. Chambers concludes rather starkly that Palmerston's significant achievements are not much more remembered in England today than they are in the islands of the Caribbean.
Wow, that's quite a put-down. It really highlights the paradox of his legacy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hugely successful, often in defending British interests, immensely popular with the public in his time,
Absolutely adored by many.
but also frequently abrasive, high-handed with monarchs and allies, perhaps morally questionable in some actions like the Opium Wars, and maybe better at short-term tactical wins than long-term strategic vision, especially towards the end.
I think that's fair. Lowe suggests that in his final years, Palmerston seemed increasingly out of step with the times. He failed to see that Bismarck's Prussia, not Napoleon III's France, was becoming the main threat to the European balance of power. He continued acting as if Britain still held the overwhelming dominance it had immediately after 1815. But the world was changing rapidly, and British relative power, while still great, was beginning to wane.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, consider this. In less than 6 years after Palmerston's death, the Prussians under Bismarck had decisively defeated both the Austrians in 1866 and then the French in 1870-71, uniting Germany into a powerful new empire right in the center of Europe. Napoleon III was overthrown and became a refugee in England. And in all these monumental power-shifting events, British influence was effectively nil. The balance of power had shifted dramatically and arguably not in Britain's long-term favor.
Which leaves us with a really important question to ponder, doesn't it? What can Palmerston's long, incredibly eventful career teach us today about that complex interplay between a leader's personality, the power of public opinion, and the constantly shifting sands of global power dynamics? Especially perhaps when a nation's relative influence might be starting to decline. How does a leader's enduring popularity like Palmerston's sometimes mask underlying strategic miscalculations or failure to adapt to new realities?
That is a great thought to leave you with. An invitation, really, to consider how even the most celebrated and popular figures in history might be viewed very differently when seen through the longer lens of history's broader changes and consequences.